4:47 a.m. Central Time, Chicago, Illinois. The temperature was 11 degrees below freezing. The streets were empty. The university campus was dark. Most of the city was asleep. But 300 federal agents were not. They moved in coordinated silence across 18 locations simultaneously: FBI, DEA, ICE, U.S. Marshals, Department of Homeland Security Investigations, Illinois State Police, Chicago Police Department tactical units, U.S. military liaison officers providing logistical support and surveillance coordination. No sirens, no announcements, no warnings. This was not a typical operation. At precisely 4:47 a.m., armed federal agents breached the private residence of Dr. Jonathan Mercer, the sitting president of one of Chicago's most respected private universities. A man who had served in that position for 9 years. A man who had overseen the education of over 30,000 students. A man who had been photographed with senators, philanthropists, and city council members. A man who had been running one of the largest drug trafficking and money laundering operations in the Midwest. By 5:13 a.m., Dr. Mercer was in federal custody. By 6:30 a.m., 312 individuals had been arrested across 6 states. By noon, federal agents had seized 14 tons of narcotics: fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, synthetic opioids with no street names yet, chemicals used to manufacture pills that looked identical to prescription medication. The wholesale street value exceeded $900 million. This was not a drug bust. This was the dismantling of a national infrastructure. This was not a typical raid. The American public has become familiar with cartel arrests. News cycles are flooded with images of border seizures, stash houses, tunnels, and gang violence. The public has learned to associate drug trafficking with certain visuals: tattoos, weapons, violence, chaos. But this operation looked nothing like that. Dr. Jonathan Mercer did not fit the profile. He held a doctorate in economics from an Ivy League institution. He had published research on financial systems and institutional governance. He had no criminal record, no gang affiliations, no history of violence. He had been vetted by a board of trustees, background checked by federal contractors, and cleared for positions that required fiduciary responsibility over hundreds of millions of dollars in endowments and federal research grants. He was not a cartel member in the traditional sense. He was something far more dangerous. He was a facilitator, and he was not alone. Among the 312 individuals arrested that morning were 4 deputy administrators within the university's financial office, 7 employees of a Chicago-based logistics company that managed freight for academic institutions, 12 staff members at a suburban medical supply warehouse, 18 employees of a regional trucking company, 2 sitting members of a county zoning board, 1 assistant district attorney, 5 licensed attorneys who operated a law firm specializing in corporate compliance, 14 certified public accountants, 23 property managers overseeing residential and commercial real estate, 31 administrative staff across multiple municipal offices, and over 200 individuals working in roles that appeared entirely unrelated to narcotics. None of them looked like criminals. That was the point. The invisible system. The investigation that led to this operation began 22 months earlier. It did not begin with a drug seizure. It began with an anomaly. A Treasury Department analyst noticed irregular financial activity tied to a series of nonprofit organizations in Illinois. The organizations were registered as educational support foundations. They filed annual tax documents. They reported donations. They issued grants. They appeared legitimate. But the money did not behave like nonprofit money. It moved too quickly. It was dispersed in patterns that did not match standard charitable behavior. It was transferred through multiple accounts in small increments that avoided federal reporting thresholds. It vanished into business transactions that were difficult to trace. The Treasury Department forwarded the case to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The FBI opened a preliminary inquiry. Within 6 weeks, investigators identified connections between the nonprofit organizations and a network of limited liability companies operating in Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Missouri, and Iowa. The companies were registered under different names. They listed different business activities. Some were construction firms, some were consulting agencies, some were import-export businesses, some were property management companies. But they all shared one characteristic. They were moving money in ways that made no economic sense. The FBI escalated the case to a multi-agency task force. The Drug Enforcement Administration joined. Immigration and Customs Enforcement joined. Homeland Security Investigations joined. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois took lead prosecution authority. For the next 18 months, federal investigators conducted surveillance, analyzed financial records, intercepted communications, and tracked shipments. They used title to thief through wiretaps. They deployed confidential informants. They executed search warrants. They followed money across borders. And they discovered something that changed the nature of the investigation entirely. The network was not just laundering money, it was moving narcotics through institutional infrastructure. How it worked. The operation functioned like a legitimate business. It had departments, it had managers, it had payroll, it had logistics, it had accounting, it had legal counsel, it had compliance procedures. It looked like a corporation, but it was a cartel distribution network. Here is how it functioned. Phase 1. Acquisition narcotics entered the United States through southern border crossings and Canadian ports of entry. The drugs were concealed inside commercial freight shipments that appeared entirely legal. Construction materials, agricultural supplies, industrial equipment, medical supplies. The shipments were processed through customs using falsified documentation created by the law firm arrested in the operation. The attorneys drafted invoices, bills of lading, and certificates of origin that passed federal inspection. Once inside the United States, the shipments were routed to warehouses operated by the logistics company that managed freight for academic institutions. The warehouses were registered. They were inspected. They had business licenses. They appeared to be part of the university's supply chain. Phase 2. Concealment. Inside the warehouses, the narcotics were removed from the original shipments and repackaged. They were placed inside containers labeled as educational materials, laboratory supplies, medical equipment, and office furniture. The repackaging was conducted by employees who believed they were working for a legitimate logistics company. Most of them did not know what they were handling. They were paid standard wages. They received benefits. They filed taxes. They were unknowing participants in a federal crime. Phase 3. Distribution. The repackaged narcotics were transported using the trucking company's fleet. The trucks were licensed. The drivers were certified. The routes were scheduled. The deliveries were logged. The trucks delivered shipments to residential addresses, commercial properties, and business locations across 6 states. The deliveries were signed for by property managers, office administrators, and warehouse staff who were part of the network. The drugs were then distributed to regional dealers through a secondary network of couriers who operated under the cover of food delivery services, rideshare platforms, and courier companies. Phase 4. Monetization. The proceeds from drug sales were funneled back through the same infrastructure. Cash was deposited into accounts owned by the limited liability companies. The companies reported the money as revenue from construction contracts, consulting fees, and property management services. The money was then transferred to the nonprofit organizations, which issued payments to the university for research grants, facility improvements, and program funding. The university processed the payments through its financial office. The payments appeared as legitimate institutional funding. The money entered the endowment. It was invested. It was cleaned. And Dr. Jonathan Mercer oversaw the entire process. Scale and consequences 14 tons of narcotics is not a street-level quantity, it is not a local supply, it is a national threat. To understand the scale, consider this. 1 kilogram of fentanyl can produce approximately 500,000 lethal doses. The federal agents seized over 6 tons of fentanyl in this operation. That is 6,000 kilograms. That is 3 billion lethal doses. 3 billion. The current population of the United States is approximately 330 million people. The amount of fentanyl seized in this operation could have killed every person in the United States 9 times over. And that was only one component of the seizure. The methamphetamine seized could have supplied the entire Midwest for 6 months. The cocaine could have flooded the East Coast for a year. The synthetic opioids were chemical compounds that had not yet been classified by the DEA. There was no approved method to detect them. There was no standard overdose reversal protocol. They were designed to evade law enforcement and medical intervention. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, over 107,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in the most recent reporting year. 71% of those deaths involved synthetic opioids. Fentanyl is the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. The network dismantled in this operation was directly responsible for trafficking narcotics that contributed to those statistics. Federal prosecutors stated that the organization had been operating for at least 6 years. Conservative estimates suggest that the network moved over 40 tons of narcotics during that time. The death toll attributable to the organization is unknown. It will never be fully calculated. But it is measured in thousands. Families destroyed, children orphaned, communities shattered, emergency rooms overwhelmed, morgues overflowing, parents burying their children, spouses planning funerals, friends finding bodies. This was not a victimless crime. This was a war being waged inside American cities, and most people did not know it was happening. War-level federal response. The scope of the operation required coordination that resembled a military campaign. Federal agencies began planning the operation 4 months in advance. They created a joint command center. They established secure communication channels. They synchronized tactical units across 6 states. They coordinated arrest warrants, search warrants, and seizure orders through multiple federal courts. They used technology and resources typically reserved for counterterrorism operations. Surveillance aircraft monitored target locations for weeks. Federal agents used drones equipped with infrared cameras to track movement inside warehouses and residential properties. They intercepted encrypted communications using classified technology. They tracked vehicles using GPS devices installed during covert entries. They mapped the entire network. On the morning of the operation, over 900 law enforcement personnel were deployed. They executed 43 search warrants simultaneously. They arrested individuals in Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Missouri, and Iowa within a 2-hour window. The operation required military precision. U.S. military liaison officers provided logistical support. They coordinated air assets. They provided secure communication infrastructure. They assisted with intelligence analysis. They did not participate in arrests, but their involvement demonstrated the severity of the threat. This was not a law enforcement operation. This was a national security response. The evidence. The evidence seized during the operation filled 6 federal warehouses. Federal agents recovered over 14 tons of narcotics, 417 firearms, including fully automatic rifles and explosives, $12 million in cash, over 200 vehicles, including trucks, vans, and luxury cars used in the operation, 83 residential and commercial properties purchased with drug proceeds, 17,000 pages of financial records, over 500 electronic devices containing communications, financial data, and operational plans, laboratory equipment used to manufacture synthetic drugs, packaging materials designed to conceal narcotics inside legitimate shipments. The evidence was cataloged, photographed, and entered into federal custody. Forensic accountants began tracing financial transactions. Digital forensic specialists began extracting data from seized devices. DEA chemists began analyzing the chemical composition of the seized narcotics. The investigation did not end with the arrests. It expanded. Federal prosecutors stated that the evidence revealed connections to additional criminal organizations operating in other states. The investigation led to the identification of over 400 additional suspects. It revealed links to international trafficking organizations operating in Mexico, Canada, and China. The full scope of the network is still being investigated. The aftermath. The arrests sent shockwaves through Chicago and the surrounding region. The university issued a statement expressing shock and disbelief. The Board of Trustees placed several senior administrators on leave. The Faculty Senate called for an independent investigation. Students organized protests, demanding accountability and transparency. Parents questioned whether their children were safe. Alumni questioned whether their donations had been used to fund criminal activity. Federal agencies questioned whether other universities had been compromised. The scandal extended beyond the university. The law firm was dissolved. Its clients scrambled to find new representation. Ongoing cases were reviewed for potential misconduct. The Illinois State Bar opened disciplinary proceedings against the attorneys involved. The logistics company lost its contracts. Its employees were laid off. Its business partners severed ties. The company filed for bankruptcy. The trucking company's fleet was seized. Its operating licenses were revoked. Its drivers lost their jobs. The county zoning board was placed under federal oversight. The assistant district attorney was disbarred and faces criminal charges. The property managers lost their licenses. Dozens of businesses collapsed. Hundreds of people lost their jobs. Families lost their income. But these were not the primary victims. The primary victims were the individuals and families destroyed by the drugs that network distributed. The parents who buried their children. The children who lost their parents. The communities that watched their neighbors die. The damage cannot be quantified, and the trust that was shattered cannot be easily restored. The invisible threat. This operation exposed a fundamental shift in how organized crime operates in the United States. Cartels no longer rely solely on violence and intimidation. They do not operate exclusively in the shadows. They do not limit themselves to street-level distribution. They have evolved. They have learned to infiltrate legitimate institutions. They have learned to exploit the infrastructure that holds society together. They have learned to hide inside the systems that people trust. They use professionals. They use paperwork. They use legal entities. They use financial systems. They use logistics networks. They use technology. They use the same tools that legitimate businesses use, and they do it in plain sight. The university president was not a gang member. He was a respected academic. The attorneys were not criminals. They were licensed professionals. The accountants were not money launderers. They were certified public accountants. The logistics company was not a cartel front. It was a registered business. They all appeared legitimate, and that is what made them so dangerous. The American public has been conditioned to identify threats based on appearance. Criminals are supposed to look dangerous. They are supposed to act suspicious. They are supposed to operate in obvious ways, but the most dangerous threats do not announce themselves. They wear suits. They carry briefcases. They attend board meetings. They file tax returns. They pass background checks. They operate inside institutions that people trust. They are invisible. And invisibility is the most effective weapon in modern organized crime. The failure of assumptions. This operation revealed a troubling reality. The systems designed to protect the public are not sufficient. Background checks did not identify Dr. Mercer as a threat. Financial audits did not reveal the money laundering. Federal inspections did not detect the narcotics. Licensing boards did not identify the corrupt professionals. The system failed. But the failure was not due to a lack of effort. It was due to a lack of imagination. Investigators, regulators, and the public operate under assumptions about what threats look like. They assume that criminals are easily identifiable. They assume that corruption is obvious. They assume that institutional safeguards are effective. But those assumptions are outdated. Modern, organized crime does not conform to traditional patterns. It does not operate in predictable ways. It does not announce itself. It adapts. And as long as the public and law enforcement continue to rely on outdated assumptions, these networks will continue to operate. The warning. The operation in Chicago was one of the largest drug trafficking busts in U.S. history. It dismantled a network that had been operating for years. It removed 14 tons of narcotics from circulation. It arrested 312 individuals. It sent a clear message to other criminal organizations. But it did not eliminate the threat. There are other networks. There are other facilitators. There are other institutions that have been compromised. The public cannot rely solely on law enforcement to identify and dismantle these operations. Federal agencies are stretched thin. They are under-resourced. They are facing threats that are more sophisticated than ever before. The public must become part of the defense. That does not mean vigilantism. It does not mean paranoia. It does not mean suspecting every institution. It means awareness. It means understanding that danger no longer looks dangerous. It means recognizing that the systems people trust can be exploited. It means paying attention to patterns that do not make sense. It means asking questions when things appear too convenient, too organized, or too perfect. It means understanding that the most effective disguise is normalcy. The erosion of trust. One of the most damaging consequences of this operation is the erosion of trust. The university was supposed to be a place of learning. It was supposed to be a safe environment. It was supposed to represent integrity and academic excellence. Instead, it was used as a tool to distribute poison. The law firm was supposed to provide legal guidance. It was supposed to operate within ethical boundaries. It was supposed to represent justice. Instead, it facilitated crime. The logistics company was supposed to deliver goods. The trucking company was supposed to transport products. The property managers were supposed to oversee real estate. Instead, they enabled death. Every institution involved in this operation was supposed to serve the public. Every professional involved was supposed to uphold standards. Every system involved was supposed to protect people. They all failed. And the public is left wondering, what else has been compromised? That question does not have an easy answer, and that uncertainty is one of the most corrosive consequences of this operation. Trust is the foundation of society. It is what allows people to function without constant suspicion. It is what allows systems to operate efficiently. It is what allows communities to thrive. When that trust is shattered, society becomes fragile. The cost of complacency. The individuals arrested in this operation did not start as criminals. Most of them were ordinary people. They had jobs. They had families. They had bills to pay. They had aspirations. They had lives that appeared normal. But at some point, they made a choice. Some of them made that choice knowingly. They understood what they were doing. They understood the consequences. They chose profit over responsibility. Others made that choice unknowingly. They were manipulated. They were deceived. They were told they were working for legitimate organizations. They believed what they were told. But whether the choice was knowing or unknowing, the result was the same. They became part of a system that killed people. That is the cost of complacency. It is the cost of not asking questions. It is the cost of not paying attention. It is the cost of accepting things at face value. It is the cost of prioritizing convenience over scrutiny. Complacency is not a passive state. It is an active enabler of harm. The path forward. The federal government has committed additional resources to investigating institutional corruption tied to organized crime. The FBI has created specialized units focused on financial crimes involving nonprofits and academic institutions. The DEA has expanded its intelligence operations, targeting professional facilitators. ICE has increased scrutiny of logistics companies and freight operators. But resources are limited. The government cannot monitor every institution. It cannot investigate every anomaly. It cannot prevent every compromise. The public must become part of the solution. That begins with awareness. It begins with understanding that modern crime does not announce itself. It begins with recognizing that the most dangerous threats are often the ones that appear normal. It continues with vigilance. It continues with asking questions when financial activity does not make sense. It continues with reporting suspicions to appropriate authorities. It continues with demanding transparency from institutions. And it ends with accountability. It ends with holding professionals to ethical standards. It ends with supporting law enforcement efforts to investigate corruption. It ends with refusing to accept excuses when institutions fail. The operation in Chicago was a success, but it was also a warning. The systems that hold society together are vulnerable. The institutions that people trust can be exploited. The professionals who are supposed to serve the public can be corrupted, and the cost of ignoring that reality is measured in lives. Final reflection. On the morning of the operation, federal agents arrested a university president in his home. They seized 14 tons of narcotics. They dismantled a network that had operated for years, but they did not eliminate the threat. They exposed it. And exposure is only the first step. The question now is, what will the public do with that information? Will it lead to meaningful change? Will it lead to increased vigilance? Will it lead to stronger institutional safeguards? Or will it be forgotten in the next news cycle? The answer to that question will determine whether operations like this become more common or less common in the years ahead. Because the networks are still out there. The facilitators are still operating. The institutions are still vulnerable. And the drugs are still killing people. The only difference is whether the public chooses to pay attention. This is not entertainment. This is a national warning.